gave a talk, pretty much the one I'll be saying today. And I met somebody after my talk and said, "Do you want to come to Oxford?" And I said, "Sure." When? He said, "In 2 weeks." And here I am. I'm Bill Kolbrener.
Welcome. I'm Ansel Brown. I was a scholar in residence last year. And Charles and I had some really dynamic conversations last year about the parallels and the common experiences of the African and Jewish diaspora experiences. And so we just saw the need to continue the conversation. I look forward to our conversation this afternoon.
And I'll just say very quickly, these are issues, after the conversations with Ansel, I've spent most of my life engaged in these issues in different ways through my scholarship, and also dealing with issues of human rights from Soviet Jewry to the indigenous people, the First Nations of Canada, Ethiopian Jewry, and I was active in the anti-apartheid movement, and also issues of racism in Canada and the UK. So these are questions that have always sort of been important to me.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Rome, president of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And as an educator, a lifelong educator, I've been involved in these issues from the time of being a student to my current position, and it's something that's very important to me. And dialogues, discussion, and education is critical to becoming an informed human being, and so this is really important to me.
Hi, I'm Carlton. A lot of this has been, I suppose, as for many of us, the water that I've been swimming in all my life. When I was in elementary school, about the second grade, I had been politicized already through conversations with my parents about the civil rights movement. I started off saying, I wrote, "How can you do it in those days? You beat us, mistreat us, and call us your slaves." I was in the second grade. So I was asked to think about these things sitting on mom's lap a long time ago, but more recently, as a graduate student, I came to Oxford around the same time as Charles, in 1984. And with the advice of my dear mentor, Dr. Raymond, I had begun reading PPE and politics, philosophy, and economics. And after a year of just being engaged in that, I said, I have to find something that's more meaningful for me, that's more directly tied to my pain and to my concerns. And that became my cross-cultural study of race, sex, and class in Britain, and the development of a theoretical framework, which I came up with later.
Okay, so thank you. So we're going to start, we're going to have each panelist will speak for approximately 5 minutes, and Ansel will start off.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, Charles. Well, when I look around the world and peer into history and examine the common experiences of African and Jewish communities around the world and throughout history, I find that the commonalities and the parallels in our experiences are profound and striking. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a distinctiveness in our experiences, but I do find that there are parallels that are worth further examination. For example, just as Africans were enslaved, so also the Jewish people were enslaved. Just as Africans were exiled and alienated from our homeland, so also the Jewish people were exiled and alienated from their homeland in Israel. Just as Africans had to fight for the right to self-determination, sovereignty, and liberty, so also the Jewish people had to fight for their right to self-determination, sovereignty, and liberty. Just as Africans were subjugated by European culture, we were culturally subjugated by European societies, so also the Jewish people were subjugated culturally by European societies. Just as Africans, whether that be in the continent of Africa or in the African diaspora, we were the victims of demonization, we were stereotyped, we were scapegoated, we were considered social pariahs and a threat to society. So also our Jewish brothers and sisters, they were demonized, they were subjugated, they were stereotyped, they were considered social pariahs and a threat to society. And so as I looked and made these observations, I asked myself why. Why can we not just be? Why everywhere we exist, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in the United Kingdom, whether it's in France, Asia, Africa, why are African people and Jewish people, people of African and Jewish heritage, always maligned, always hated, always the victims of bigotry? And so what I want to do, Charles, if you allow me, I just want to take just a moment to read a couple of paragraphs from a paper that I recently presented at the Racialization and Publicness Conference here at Oxford University that I think may shed some light on this question. And if nothing else, I believe it will be some food for thought for our conversation this afternoon. There is a consistent psychology behind the ethnic alienation of Africans and Jews throughout history. Revisiting the Moses narrative in the Jewish Torah, the psychosis behind this oppression is strikingly manifest. In the recorded story of Israeli bondage in Egypt, the Jewish male babies were killed by the Egyptians who feared that, and I'll quote from the passage from Exodus. The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than me. And that's an important phrase. That's really going at what I'm getting at, right? So this was the Egyptians when there's a precursor of the oppression of the Jewish people, the bondage of the Jewish people in Egypt. The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. So I want to expound upon what I'm seeing in this text. It gives us some insight as to what's going on with racism and anti-Semitism. In the timeless wisdom of this text, the psychology of supremacy and cultural subjugation is exposed as what I believe to be fundamentally fear and the social ills that emanate from this fear: envy, demonization, and ultimately oppression and other genocidal outcomes. The onslaught to debase and dehumanize Africans and Jews historically has been fueled by deep-seated societal insecurity. Dominant societies have been keen on their own irrational sense of fragility and observation of the resilience that has sustained Jewish and African communities. Caleb Myers notes in his book, Critical Alliance, African Americans, Jews, and the Middle East Conundrum, that the chutzpah or nerve, and I would add even strength, of African American and Jewish communities to stand and thrive against all odds is a common characteristic, one that in my view has unnerved dominant societies. Dominant societies in essence have sought to undermine the self-realization of those they perceive as threatening to their own sense of security. The irrational fear towards Africans has been that they pose a threat to the population of the dominant societies, while the fear of Jews has been that they pose a threat to the power of dominant societies. Not surprisingly, white supremacists habitually attack people of African and Jewish heritage together as an amalgamate threat to white dominance. These ethnic phobias and bigotries are deeply rooted in psychological complexes of inferiority, masked and inverted as superiority. The dominant societies have taken this position to externally stabilize an underlying internal psychosis of perceived weakness. These dangerous perceptions must be overcome by safeguarding the sovereignty of African and Jewish communities to preserve their vitality and optimally contribute to the common good of society, contrary to these false constructions. So essentially what I'm saying here, and I know there's been some discussion about the distinctiveness of African and Jewish struggle against the trials and adversities that we have overcome. I think the analogy is that anti-Semitism is punching up and racism is punching down. Well, I want to add a layer to that to say that I believe a punch is a punch, right? So whether it's a right hook, left hook, uppercut, or jab, I believe that there is a commonality in the fundamental motivation of the punch, and that is this: that anytime you see oppression in our world, whether that's at a domestic level, whether that's at a social level, whether that's at a national, international, political level, I believe that there is always an inferiority complex or a fear and an insecurity that is masking as superiority. And I think Dr. King recognized this in his brilliant letter from a Birmingham jail when he talked about the sickness of Southern segregationist society. So in essence, what I'm saying is that I don't believe people of African and Jewish heritage have been persecuted because of what is wrong with us. Although, of course, we do know that there are quite a few things within our communities that need to be addressed, but I believe we have been persecuted because of what has been perceived as being right about us. I don't believe we've been bullied because we are weak. I believe we have been bullied because we are strong, and our strength has been a perceived threat to those who have bullied us. So I think we have quite a bit to work with. I believe we need to stand together with fortitude, with resoluteness, and with solidarity to essentially fight and to eradicate the blight of racism and anti-Semitism in our world. And with that, I will hand over the microphone to my colleagues, and I look forward to the conversation.
I just want to preface my prepared remarks with an observation that just comes from being here for a couple of days. And I think my presentation about intersectionality today is a pretty polemical one, and I want to qualify it a little bit. I think there's a possibility for intersectionality, not as I'll describe it here. And I think part of that really comes from or emerges from the dynamic of the diversity of this group. And on the one hand, I know that people here have come to learn about anti-Semitism, but I think there's a fundamental asymmetry that's built into this conference just because of the nature of it. And that is that Jews do not have, I mean, people have said this all day, Jews do not have a monopoly on suffering. And I think there's an expression of gratitude that really needs to be made to those people who've come here to learn about anti-Semitism, especially when the President of the United States is using Israel as a way of dividing our communities. It's very important, I think, for us, as you just said, to find ways of coming together. The BDS movement today gets its lifeblood from the Progressive Academy, post-humanist professors with their ideological narratives and millennial students assenting easily and quickly to a tweetable narrative they understand. Indeed, in that narrative, Israel stands for the evils of Western modernity against a fantasy Palestine, one that is sanitized of religious fundamentalism, intolerance, and political extremism. The lack of historical contextualization of the conflict in Middle Eastern studies departments and the lack of historical memory among millennials makes fighting BDS a special challenge. Further, it's not just the millennial assent to BDS which is problematic, but rather the surreptitious entry of anti-Israel sentiment into more moderate discourses about Israel. That not just students, but their parents assent to their children's progressive sentiments, tacitly accept or even just tolerate the BDS perspective, they may have a point. Indeed, it is the collapse of liberalism in America and England, the emergence of populist left and right in the former, that most challenges Israel's claims to existence. The post-humanist and Middle Eastern studies departments are no longer honest brokers on the subject. But as a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education noted, some of the younger generation of humanist scholars are tiring of the elitism of the critical theory moment that has extended from the late 80s to the current moment. Such scholars should be addressed and engaged and offered a different set of narratives through which to understand the conflict here in Israel, as well as the provenance of the anti-Zionism they may espouse. One of those as yet unarticulated narratives begins in post-World War II Germany and the School of Social Research and the Frankfurt School led by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Outside of academic circles, Adorno became known for the proclamation, "No poetry after Auschwitz," by which he meant that the death camps marked the end of any pretense of Western refinement and culture. How, after all, do you write a sonnet in the shadow of Auschwitz? More than that, however, the pursuit of enlightenment and rational universalism, in Adorno's view, led directly to the Nazis, with the distinction between civilization and barbarism blurred finely in the final solution. That is, for Adorno, the promises of enlightenment freedom led to fascism and the death camps. In an ironic set of historical turns, the humanists of the 1980s appropriated the Frankfurt School antipathy towards Western Enlightenment, providing a legacy for today's progressives who have turned their suspicions against Israel and the Jews. Starting in the 1970s, Michel Foucault, the most continuously influential figure in the humanities over the past decades, adopted the perspective of the Frankfurt School for Social and Cultural History. Writing on love, sex, mental illness, and the prison system, Foucault found all aspects of Western life to be in the fields of power, with his discipline and punish turning the prison into a metaphor for Western cultural domination. A self-acknowledged follower of Foucault, the Marxist literary critic Terry Eagleton, with whom I studied here at Oxford, gave voice to the still prevalent academic gospel that reason must be understood as a dominative instrument of patriarchy and enlightenment. The Marxist literary critic, Edward Said, with whom I studied at Columbia, still the guiding spirit of many American Middle Eastern study departments, repackaged Foucault, calling the Enlightenment the master sign of Orientalism and colonialism. In his now canonical Orientalism, bridging between the continental literary criticism of the 70s and Marxist political activism, Said links Zionism, for him the colonialist project par excellence, and Enlightenment rationality. That the real aims of the purveyors of Enlightenment are power and domination is writ large in the Jewish state, standing for the excesses of Western theology and rationality. What starts as a critique of Enlightenment reason and fascism is turned against Israel and the Jews. Enter progressives for whom the modern university is understood to be complicit in the processes of domination, a self-sustaining bastion of, I'm sure you've heard the term, neoliberalism. In a post and electronic intifada, university administrators are said to be deeply embedded in the project of corporate neoliberalism. Further, Zionism and neoliberalism converge, with the contemporary university said to align itself with Zionism as a settler project. The New Arab website decries Israel-American neoliberalism as the place where Western culture hangs its machine guns and parks its drones. Academics may not express this perspective in such hyperbolic terms, but in concert with the BDS movement, they create a moral cosmos, as rigid as any to be found in conventional theologies, in which Israel represents all evils, the colonialist nation state, the false promises of liberal enlightenment, as well as the fundamentalism of religion. It's a nice package, right? With the wrongs of the West displaced onto the Jewish state, undergraduates and elite programs in America naturally pass judgment on apartheid Israel, viewing the conflict through the allegorical lens provided by their progressive professors. The further paradox is that progressives are taken in by the cynical uses of Islam, with Linda Sarsour, the master at this art, as a wedge against the ideologies of Judeo-Christianity, when of course Islam carries with it the very hierarchical values against which progressives position themselves most adamantly. But the Islamic purveyors of BDS mask their theological agendas, claiming their monotheism enacts cutting-edge cultural and political practices, especially when it comes to gender, and on the way convince liberals that all evils of the West are somehow distilled in the Jewish state. Indeed, left populists in their political zeal forget that liberal values and institutions they have rejected enable their political voice and standing. We talked about critical thinking, namely the belief in tolerance, a neutral public sphere, and free speech. The millennial break with historical memory, which progressive university professors both cultivate and feed upon, leads to a refusal to acknowledge that free speech is part of a 200-year-old, indeed fragile experiment attempted in only a few corners of the world. That the current Israeli government has aligned itself with demagogues and waged war against democratic institutions does make that argument more difficult to sell or brand. To be successful, Jews must distinguish themselves from cynical right-wing populists, evangelists, and MAGA Trumpers, and show those committed to democracy that Zionism is an outgrowth of liberalism, not its contradiction. Today, liberal Jews fail to remember what would have been obvious to their ancestors, habituated to hatred and violence from left and right. Intersectionality, here's the polemical part, excludes Jews not because they represent among all minorities an unacceptable form of difference, but rather because Israel represents the core ideals against which all other repressed minorities are united together fighting. I know I'm generalizing. The recent exclusion of Jews from intersectional gatherings is not based upon a failure to understand Jewish minority claims, but an image of the Jews and Israel as representing the antithesis of all progressive values. The war against the Jews from both left and right is also against the democratic traditions of the West. Zionism is part of the civilizational process. It's fraught with problems, but it is part of that process, part of the liberal tradition. Like in the 30s in Germany, hatred of the Jews manifests the West's own suicidal tendencies, the penchant for the irrational, now abetted by populist extremists on both left and right. Progressives may pay lip service to the democratic institutions that serve their interests, but anti-Semitism reveals not only their enthrallment to the world's oldest hatred, but to a populism that takes precedence over democratic values. We must challenge those devoted to the traditions of classical liberalism to understand that BDS and its progressive advocates not only undermine the Jewish state, but the democratic institutions upon which our civilization rests. That was more than 5 minutes, but thanks.
My old man's a white old man, and my old mother's black. If ever I curse that white old man, I take my curses back. If ever I curse my black old mother and wished she were in hell, I'm sorry for that evil wish, and now I wish her well. My old man died in a fine big house. My mom died in a shack. I wonder where I'm going to die, being neither white nor black. You know, the more I live, the more I seem to see, I seem to realize that there seems to be a very elegant simplicity in complexity. That there is, if we look, if we do the work, we can find elegant simplicity in complexity. So my talk really just talks about really 3 things, but those 3 things I would love for us to drill down very deeply into. And those 3 things are race, which I will put like Charles Husband's in quotation marks, race, sex, and class. For me, that's the whole lesson. It's not so much those 3 things, but the way in which they're used. And I would argue that most scholars that I found, there's some brilliant, brilliant scholars who have published far more than I have, don't use those lenses in perhaps an optimal way. And as a result of a praxis that I was involved in Oxford with a brilliant anthropologist named Juliet Blair, I stumbled upon, in the late 1980s, a concept which I later took to Columbia University called the tripartite prism. And I like to work my way to that theoretical framework, which I shared with students and which I tossed around with colleagues of mine in New York. So we still have a lot of work to do, and so I would like to drill down into those things. So the first thing is I think to look at the category and the taxonomies of race, and to begin a rigorous review of that complexity. You combine that then to move further into sex and class. And what I would do is I would look through each of these prisms individually, and then suggest that we find an interesting way to live through them concurrently. And let's put everything together and see where we end up. So my goal in the talk is ambitious, but as I said before, it's simple. It is to provide professors and students who are gathered here with a systemic approach, which I conceptualize here in Oxford. This approach will hopefully assist the professors and the students here. The professors with the shaping of your syllabi, and the students with the conceptualization of your post-institute implementation projects. So race. I have, again, race in a quotation mark. In quotation marks. And I see it also as maybe the devil we know. We can gain a lot of insights by briefly exploring cross-culturally Britain and the United States, the issues of race, sex, and class. And I heard a scholar years ago talk about race, and she said, it's kind of like being hit with by a metaphor. So we're going to talk about the social construction of race, the other problematica with regard to race. But I'd like to just show a couple of cross-cultural examples. And my basic argument about race is going to be that it's real and it's not real, right? And we kind of know that, but we kind of ignore that. So I'm going to invite us to be a little bit more systematic and a little bit more consistent in our application, our understanding of these terms and our use of them. Because I think that they can do kind of what David Hoffman's, one of his presenters, asked us to do, which is to check our own blind spots. So here's race as just a horrible metaphor, kind of, Beowulf, roaming, Beowulf having to fight with Grendel. In 1596, Elizabeth I ordered the expulsion of blackamoors from Britain. Some 4 or 5 years later, in 1601, a British royal proclamation continued to expel these newcomers. And I have to tell you, they weren't identified by their haplogroups, right? They weren't identified by the Human Genome Project. It wasn't that this is an L1, this is an L2, right? This is how they were expelled. This is how race was made to seem real. The Queen's Majesty, this is a direct quote, the Queen's Majesty has been greatly distressed in these times of dearth, and all the more discontented to understand the great number of Negroes and blackamoors which are crept into this realm. A great annoyance of Her Majesty's own liege people who want relief that these people consume. They are also, with all speed, to be avoided and discharged out of Her Majesty's dominion. This was based on the relief that the people had purportedly consumed against the availability of her liege people. They added something else though, which touches upon, I think in a really interesting way, our Jewish brethren and sisters. It said, it went further, they said, as also that the most of them, this is further rationale for kicking them out, that most of them are infidels, having no understanding of Christ and his gospel. Such was the nature of their good news. Some 300 years earlier, King Edward I of England had issued, July 18th is coming up for us this week, July 18th, 1290, the Edict of Expulsion, a royal decree expelling all Jews from England. And that held in place for hundreds of years until Oliver Cromwell permitted Jews to return to England in 1657. They were allowed then, and only then, to practice their faith openly. So Now, if we interrogate the concept of race further, we can see multiple ways in which the alterity which is manifested through skin color, phenotypes, and other forms of otherness, such as faith, and other aspects of ethnicity, caused powerful hegemonic actors in England and colonial America to act. Again, let's hop across the pond and see how race kind of seemed real, was made to seem real to the early colonial settlers. The earliest record which we have, and I know that many of you already know this, the earliest record that we have in the United States about the presence of enslaved Africans in the New World came in 1619. John Rolfe, secretary and recorder of the Virginia colony, wrote as follows. About the last of August, he recorded, there came to Virginia, and he names the ship, a Dutch man of war that sold us 20 neggers, N-E-G-E-R-S. That sold us 20 neggers. I'm sorry Femi's not here, because I want him to hear this part. They did not say they sold us X number of people from the Igbo ethnic group. They didn't say they sold us Y number of Yoruba men, or Z number of Hausa women, and Z prime number of Fulani women. Said they sold us 20 neggers. They were conflated into one flat, unscientific identity. We know contradictions, those of us who have studied quote-unquote race in the United States, we know the contradictions and the hypocrisies that prevailed all too well in the United States, in ways in which race was again used to seem real. And our hero, U.S. naturalist, Lockean, Thomas Jefferson, gave us some interesting texts as well. Let's take a peek at what Thomas Jefferson almost had put into the Declaration of Independence and was kind of yanked at the last minute. One of his criticism of Thomas Jefferson was that he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, against its most sacred rights of liberty, in persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating them and conveying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel begins with Jews but doesn't end with Jews. These infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian, does that mean white? Of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. This was almost in our Declaration of Independence. Can you imagine your fourth grader reading this? He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this equitable commerce. There are many other examples from text, and we can delve into that later, but we can begin to see how race is beginning to be made to seem real. We're establishing a pedestrian definition of race, a common sense definition of race, which I would argue is a horrible inheritance and something that many people still quite unscientifically believe to be real. So that's the first lens of my tripartite prism.
Thank you. And I take a much different approach to this. I appreciate these intellectuals and their perspective. As a college administrator at a university, I'm more of a practitioner in my day-to-day. And I consider myself a quasi-intellectual. And the reason I say that is because just like most people I talk to on the campus, I can look at the information, I can take in the information, but at a quasi-intellectual, I can be emotionally charged and I can ignore the facts. Because that's what most people do. No matter what the facts are, they interpret it and they disregard what they don't like. And so when we talk about intersectionality, one of the things that I did as I was coming here is I talked to several different people, some friends, some not, some formally educated and some not. And as I talked to them about the Jewish experience, the African American, whether it's a woman or sexual identity, they were all passionate about their experiences. And what I've learned working on a college campus as I've dealt with students and student organizations or individual students, whatever they're going through, whatever their suffrage is, that's the most important and impactful suffrage that's happening in the world. And as we talk about intersectionality, it causes people to have to acknowledge that we've all gone through something, and what you went through is what I went through isn't as significant as what you went through. And what I was trying to figure out is, why is this notion, this rejection of intersectionality between Jews and African Americans or Black people or others, why is there resistance? And from what I could ascertain as a quasi-intellectual is that when we admit that there's intersectionality, we admit that someone may have gone through something as devastating as what I've gone through. And as I talk to many African Americans, when we talk about slavery, there's nothing more horrific than slavery that a people could have endured. And that's from people, whether they're intellectual or not, nothing can be worse than that. But as I've talked to some of my Jewish friends and colleagues, when they talk about their experience, nothing could be worse than what they went through. Nothing. And so once we come together and can decide that one doesn't trump the other, that we all went through something, we can have intersectionality. But until we get to that point, it's all about what I've gone through. And one of the things I realized in higher education, I came through student affairs, and many student affairs administrators, and if anyone is in higher ed and works in student affairs here, they work all the time. They work day and night. They're always on the campus. And one of the things I would say to them is they always complain about how much they work and that they work when no one else is working and their experience is so much tougher and they get paid less. And I talk to them and I say, many of them, I say, get off the cross. Because all of them want to get on the cross and say, what I endured is so much more insignificant than any other worker on the campus. And so when we look at a lot of these situations and the identity behind them, it's about who went through the most. It's not, and it's emotional when you start talking to people about the history that they've endured and you start to interpret it and the facts go out the window. Because it's emotionally charged. And so as we do this work, we have to get to a point which is very challenging, particularly when you're working with students. When a student comes into my office and they're upset and they're emotional, I can state all the facts, I can state the policies, I can state everything, but they're not moved by that. The only thing they know is, I've been wrong, something's happened to me, and I want you to do something about it. And I don't care what the rules are, I don't care what the policies are, I want you to do something about it, and I want you to know what you're going to do to the people. And if you know anything about the rules of a university with FERPA, you can't discuss how you resolve cases, even with the injured. But the injured wants to know that someone suffered for what happened to them. And so as we talk about a lot of these issues, we have to be cognizant that there's a dichotomy that exists. And whether we want to accept it or not, there are two sides or more than two sides to every situation that we discuss. So what we have to do is start engaging people to the point where we can acknowledge their suffrage, but at the same time getting them to acknowledge the suffrage of other people. And one thing, and I'll be brief with mine, one thing I know is I've worked in some challenging environments and I've worked at some universities with some very privileged students. And one of the things I noticed from the students who had great privilege is, if they had an issue or they felt they were suffering, no matter how minor I may have thought it was, to them it was the most important thing in their life. And I could trivialize it, but for them, it was as significant as what any other student was going through. And that's kind of how I believe from my observations that people think. What you go through is significant to you. And it may be small to another person and they can outsuffer you with what they've gone through. But what we go through in our minds is real. And we have to acknowledge that. And once we can acknowledge that people believe what they've gone through is significant and their suffrage is real, and I'm not going to compare my suffrage to theirs, but I can acknowledge that they're suffering, I think we can get to a point of intersectionality, but it doesn't have to be the same. But most of the times we want it to be the same, or we want to say, well, I was a slave, well, I was a slave too. Well, I lost my land, well, I lost my land too. Well, I did this, well, I did too. But you didn't have to go, you didn't do that. But the reality, it doesn't matter. It's that we've all gone through something and we have to acknowledge it.
So thank you. So all the comments were rich, so it's interesting to come at the end. So I'll try to be brief and be coherent in my jet lag. I literally haven't slept for 2 days, so bear with me. So an intersectionality of racism and anti-Semitism. I want to start with one thought, and I've been speaking to Lily about this a lot, and some other people. This is just a thought. Some of the Jewish-African commonalities, in addition to what Ansel was saying in terms of exile and slavery, is also the commonalities that we have, in a sense. The Jewish people came out of Africa. We came out of Egypt. We were called the Jews for the first time by Pharaoh, which is interesting. And the question is, culturally, particularly in pre-Christian, pre-Islamic Africa, what are the common cultural practices and worldview that Jews and Africans in different parts of Africa share? And there's a whole subject that's deep and rich in terms of wisdom and knowledge and a worldview at many levels that we share historically. And it would be amazing, I think, and maybe a space to find commonalities if we begin to explore this and share this, rather than solely, although vital, racism and anti-Semitism is vital. We do a whole, ISGAP is dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism and other forms of racisms. But on a positive note, what do we share historically, culturally, in terms of our worldview and our cultural practices? And I think that's a very kind of new area and terrain that I think we can have a lot of positive experiences rather than just kind of dealing with the negativity that we've been subjected to through European colonialism, slavery, and brutality that both peoples have experienced. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, I want to start off by saying that I think we need to acknowledge the fact that particularly the United States, where I've been living for the last 13, 14 years, I think it's a racist society, right? It's segregated, fragmented, it was created on slavery and segregation, Jim Crow. You go to any American city today, it's segregated, economically, socially, politically. It's in your face, and you have to be pretty blind not to see it. And it affects our language, it affects our perceptions, it's there. If the United States is this sort of racist society, I would also argue that, there's a strong dose of anti-Semitism in American society. So to start off with, I think we are all kind of racist and anti-Semitic and sexist and homophobic to begin the conversation. And I think that we have to really come to terms with the stereotypes that we've been socialized, and these stereotypes are reinforced every day, every hour, through social media, through television, through our friends, through our family, through our places of worship. It's there. So how can we, as intellectuals, as critical thinkers, come to terms with the society that we live in and the assumptions we have of ourselves and of the other. And I think that some of the conversations that we're having in this space too, I think we all really need to kind of redouble our efforts to kind of catch ourselves. You know, to what extent am I, not if I'm racist, to what extent am I racist? To what extent am I anti-Semitic? Me. To what extent am I sexist and homophobic and classist? So these are very important issues. Frantz Fanon said famously in France, when the anti-Semites were speaking to Fanon, this group of African intellectuals in Paris, you know, Fanon famously said that when the European intellectual leaves the room after he had spoken about the Jew, right, remember that when you leave the room, they're going to be speaking about the African. Okay, so the interconnectedness of anti-Semitism and racism, it goes way back, and it's strong in our communities as well. So these are things to think about. Malcolm X, I think I spoke about this earlier, when he went to Mecca, when he left the United States of America and he went to another society and realized in different parts of the world people perceive identity and the world differently. And I think for us in the United States and in other Western countries, we have to be mindful of the fact that there are strong, wise, ancient ways of seeing things that are different than the way we perceive them. And they're vibrant and they're alive in this world today. I also want to say that the space for cooperation and alliances, I think, is deep. And Carlton, who's my partner in this whole project, who's been a friend and a brother in the truest sense for decades, we spoke about it earlier. I think the Jewish commitment, part of the Jewish community's commitment to civil rights and the anti-apartheid movement is not self-interest, although maybe there were some benefits that were derived from being active in the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement to the Jewish communities. That I'm sure exists. But for refugees from the Holocaust, from Europe, to find themselves 10, 15 years later, sort of in the heat of a changing society, in the moment of the civil rights movement, it doesn't take a great leap of faith to understand that people who experience a racist, Nazi, fascist regime, which touched every single European Jewish person's lives, that they find a racist, segregated society where they're living in a time of change, of course, many would be concerned and attracted to the civil rights movement. It doesn't take a great leap of faith to understand that. And I'll just tell you about my story, and I know a lot of Jewish people's stories in the West and the anti-apartheid movement. I've said it earlier. In 1983, I had a political science class. Professor Sam Newmoff gave a presentation to a class at McGill University about apartheid. I went up to him after class and I said, "When did apartheid end?" 1983. He said, "No, Charles, it still exists." I was shocked. And I said, "When do you think it will end? It's going to end any day now?" And he said, "No, we don't know. It's still firmly entrenched." And I was shocked. I couldn't believe that a society was being governed by an ideology that was not so dissimilar to fascist Germany and Nazism. And I not for self-interest and benefit, I became deeply involved. I lived in squatter camps. I was shot at. I struggled. Because, and I'll remember distinctly landing, I took a flight from Montreal, I landed in Amsterdam, and that was when the European Union was starting to do multilingual airplane announcements. And I remember landing in Amsterdam to meet my professor who was in exile for 25 years, Shengia Ragavan, who conscientized Stephen Biko into politics. And I remember landing to meet him. He was in exile for 25 years, and then we were going to Durban. He was the first time back in 25 years. We met in Amsterdam, and we flew to Durban. And he had a homecoming for a hero, which was amazing to witness with him because he was in exile for so long. And I remember hearing German announcements as I was landing in Amsterdam thinking, wow, it's a miracle that I'm alive. It's a miracle that I can struggle against this fascist, Nazi, racist regime, and that I'm alive. It wasn't self-interest. I was proud to be a part of a struggle, and what I benefited from, I learned a lot from the people of South Africa, and the wisdom, and the humility in which many people struggled for human decency. And to be a part of that movement, I learned a lot. So it was an amazing experience. And a lot of Jewish people were part of that. And as a footnote to the anti-apartheid struggle in Canada, the Jewish members, only the Jewish members of the anti-apartheid movement in Canada, we were all harassed by the CSIS, which is like the Canadian secret police, because the Jews were perceived by them as communists. So how, communist Jews helping the African National Congress, which was a communist terrorist organization in those days, only the Jewish members of the anti-apartheid movement were harassed because of these stereotypes. But we dealt with it proudly. These are just random quick thoughts, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I think we also have to be mindful, this is of the reactionary forces in both of our communities. The Black Lives Matter movement is not monolithic, and it's a very important movement, in my humble opinion, for whatever it's worth. But there's a part of that movement that is being influenced directly by the Nation of Islam. Directly. And we've done research on this. The Nation of Islam is paying young artists, hip-hop artists, who are very important in the African American community, to denounce Israel and Zionism. The whole movement from Ferguson to Gaza is a very important element of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a direct result from the Nation of Islam, directly. So we also have to be mindful of how these tropes are being influenced in this sort of African-American, Jewish-American dialogue on these issues. The Anti-Defamation League, which is a human rights organization dedicated to fighting discrimination of all kinds, but is sort of in the Jewish community. Part of this Nation of Islam attack on the Jewish community is that the ADL brings American police officers to Israel to learn about counterterrorism. And the trope is that the ADL, the Jews, are bringing American police officers to Israel to teach them how to kill young African-American men. That's a prevalent trope in our communities and in our discourse. So how do we kind of be aware of reactionary forces in both of our communities and sort of elevate ourselves to a place where we could fight racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry? So we have to contextualize what is going on in our communities. And there's reactionary parts of the Jewish community that needs to be understood. Who's funding them? What's motivating them? How does that affect African-American Jewish relations? How does it affect the Jewish community standing in Israel? These are complicated, complex, changing situations that we have to, I think, be aware of.
As I talk to different people, one of the biggest factors that came up and something that you addressed, how do we come together, is a lack of trust. If we really want to talk about, as I talk to African-American people, I say, well, as we talk, they say, I don't trust them. The people I talk to, they see Jewish people as a monolithic group. It's like they're all, when you say Jewish, they have this perception, and we never got into the perception. And whatever it is, it's something that addresses a lack of trust that's happened over a period of time. And until we can get to a period of where we're trusting each other, there's probably not much that we can accomplish. So I think we really have to work on how we rebuild the trust that existed during the civil rights movement, because we've moved from that relationship, and that's, to me, an issue.
And I'll just say that I think that's an important point that Dr. Rowan makes, and that he made in his presentation, that we not expropriate the sufferings of the other. Because you're not doing someone a favor by saying, oh yeah, this was also a Holocaust, or this is also apartheid, or this is also segregation. But what I do believe affirms and uplifts the suffering of the other is when you say, hey, as a human being, I know what it's like. I've been through it. You can sort of intellectually, Charles and I talked about this, about sort of intellectually understanding what's happening with BDS and how it impacted us when we experienced it firsthand. if you've ever had a physical trauma, for example, you could intellectualize it all day, but until you've been through it, you don't really fully understand what that trauma is like. Whatever trauma it is, I know it. I can't say that I exactly know what it is like to have endured apartheid, but I do know what it was like for my mother when she walked to school on buses and the white kids she walked to school by foot and the white children spit on her. I know what it's like. I can't say I know it, but I hear the stories of what it was like for my grandfather when he went to take his kids to the swimming pool and he had to explain to 5-, 6-year-old boys of why they couldn't swim in the white swimming pool. I know what it's like. I know what it's like when my father was a star athlete, which I'll talk about more tomorrow, and spectators ran onto the field to stop him from scoring a touchdown. I don't know what it's like to be in apartheid, but I know what we experienced. And because of what we experienced, I can empathize and stand in solidarity with you and your pain and suffering. And I think that's what the opportunity is that presents itself to us as African and Jewish communities and our common sufferings. That's what I'm talking about. Not that it's the same suffering, but that we can understand what it's like and we cannot quibble about whose suffering was worse, but that we can empathize with one another. And that's what's really going to move us forward.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that. I think, first of all, the idea of competitive suffering never leads to anything really good. Shakespeare's Lear says, "I am more sinned against than sinning." And that's really a universal experience. We all feel like we're the one who is getting screwed. I want to actually suggest things perhaps a little bit differently now. Race, class, and gender, of course, identifiers. And I think, as everybody on the panel is saying, the most important thing is to be present to somebody's story, somebody's suffering. But I think what's really undermining the values that Charles talked about is the emphasis on identity politics. That I am who I am based on race, class, and gender. Of course, that's true to a certain extent. But I think there are also the other values that bring us together. And that's what we should emphasize. In Israel, I teach a class on Shakespeare in which half of the class, or maybe 35% of the class, is Jewish, 35% of the class is Arab Muslim, and 30%, math is right, and 30% of the class is Christian Arab. In that class, there is no room for identity politics, because if we don't uphold the common value of conversation, tolerance, mutual respect, and that's not easy, right? Tolerance is one thing. Mutual respect is already going much, much higher. Those are the values that keep the class together. I explained to them, or tried to explain to them, what a safe space and trigger warnings were. They were incredulous at this idea. When people are killing themselves down the block, you can't entertain such things. And then at that point, the values that Charles mentioned, those become primary. And I think that's the intersectionality that we can build here. Our common belief in justice, toleration, reasoned discourse. Of course, not all will be pure motive, but as I said yesterday, enough may not be everything, but enough is enough.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in our cultures and our heritage, and I think this could also be a space, an amazing creative space for us to learn about each other and ourselves, to create strong relations. So I'll end it there.